happening, everybody? All right, so this is a viewer requested video. TU, this video is for you, my man. So he's wondering, what's the difference between the 6-speed manual transmissions from, say, like a 392 or a 5.7 car, Mopars is what we're talking about here, by the way, and a Hellcat? Well, the short answer is torque handling capacity. The Hellcat manual transmission can handle, I want to say it's about 100 pound-feet more torque than the one that's used in the 392 or the 5.7, and it would make sense based on the power that the Hellcat makes versus the other two. But it's a little bit more of an in-depth answer, so to speak, because the question actually carries along with it some other values that I want to touch on. So let's get into those. First of all, the ratios on the TR6060s that are in, say, a 392 Scat Pack with a manual transmission are wider. There's more separation between one gear and the next as far as what one gear ratio is to the next than the Hellcat. Think of the naturally aspirated transmissions more like a wide ratio manual versus a close ratio for the Hellcat. And if you look at the specs of the transmission, or just TR6060s in general, one thing you'll notice is the more aggressive that first gear is, the lower amount of torque typically that case or that transmission will be able to carry. 297 is what is standard for the Scat Pack, let's say, transmissions, where I want to say it's like a 250 something. Again, I may not be exactly right on the ratio, but close enough for conversation anyway, for the Hellcat and also the Viper as well. Also, you can consider the Hellcat 6-speed a little bit more of a close ratio because of that much shorter gear ratio in first gear. So there's that. But the next thing that lends itself to, the next scenario that lends itself to, or at least part of the discussion, is the driving dynamic of both of those transmissions. One thing you'll notice with the naturally aspirated cars with a manual transmission is they feel a lot more snappy than the Hellcat does. And again, it goes back to just that aggressive first gear. You'll notice driving a Hellcat, it almost feels sluggish. And one of the things that I've said over and over again about Hellcats with manuals is the 370 gear just doesn't seem like enough gear for that car. Really need to go into the 390 that is standard for the naturally aspirated cars to really get some feel out of the thing. And you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're talking about a car that makes a lot more power with the Hellcat. And I got to remind you guys, the Hellcat only makes more power when you're under boost. When this car is not in boost, or even when it's making, say, 2 or maybe even 3 pounds of boost, you're just now equaling the amount of power out of the 6.4. If you're not in boost, it's actually less powerful than the 6.4. So just tooling around, the car feels like a dog until you put it into boost with the manual transmission. It's just something that I've noticed. And, you know, it's one of those strange things where you drive a 392 with a manual transmission and it feels snappy and it feels pretty fun to drive, where the Hellcat, again, because of those long gear ratios, especially in first gear, it just feels labored, like it's just struggling to get moving. That is until you stick your foot in it, and then all bets are off. But even up to that point, I think a little bit more aggressive rear gearing could go a long way in getting this heavy thing up and rolling, because we're dealing with a transmission with the same ratios as the Viper, a car that doesn't lack for torque with a huge V10 and weighs about 1,000 pounds less, give or take, or at least anecdotally it does. So at any rate, that's my impressions of the driving experience between the two transmissions. But as far as the true difference, not much of a difference really to speak of. And in terms of functionability, actual specifics, there might be something slightly different with something internally in the transmission aside from the ratios that would allow the transmission to carry a little bit more torque. But from what I've seen in my experience, there really is no difference. And if you're worried about swapping one transmission in for another, I don't know that you would really see a big difference in longevity or in durability going from one transmission to the next. I wouldn't, though, put a transmission in this car that's not rated for the torque that the Hellcat spec TR6060 is rated for, mainly because of the weight. I've actually thought of this before. Why not just put the more aggressively geared transmission in the Hellcat? I mean, it would almost seem to make sense, right? But I don't know. Mopar put that transmission in these things for a reason. And again, torque handling capacity may have been part of it. Weight may have been another. Could just be easier to throw a 390 gear in the thing and call it good enough. So at any rate, that's a wrap on this one. I hope that answered the question. I'll catch you all on the next one. Adios.